Welcome to the next lesson in the testing chapter, and in this lesson we will be talking about integration testing. I'm going to show you how to write integration tests with the help of the ASP.NET Core testing library and test containers for running our external services using Docker. In this lesson we will be testing the users module. So I'm going to start by introducing a test project for the users module integration tests. Let me choose XUnit test project, and then let's call this Evently, Modules, Users, and Integration Tests. Let's make it a .NET 8 project, and then I'm going to update the project file. Let's get rid of this because it's taken care of by directory build props, and I want to install a few NuGet packages into our test project. Let's look for Bogus, which is going to help us with some dummy data for our tests, and install the latest version. I'm also going to introduce Fluent Assertions, which we were also using for our unit tests. And then the star of the show is going to be our ASP.NET Core testing library. The one you want to install is Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing. So let's go ahead and introduce the latest version. And then I'm going to look for test containers. And this is an awesome library that allows you to easily spin up your external services using Docker. And it also comes with a lot of additional NuGet packages covering some of the most popular services. So we're going to install test containers PostgreSQL because we are using Postgres as our database. Let's also introduce test containers Redis because we are using Redis for caching. Now I'm going to look for test containers Keycloak because Keycloak is our identity provider, and let's go ahead and install the latest version of the test containers Keycloak NuGet package. Now I'm going to also update the existing packages that I have inside of my test project to the latest versions that are available, and this completes the setup for the integration testing project. As far as external dependencies are concerned, the most important ones are Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing, which is going to allow us to spin up an in-memory instance of our ASP.NET Core Web API, and the test containers library is going to allow us to run Keycloak, Postgres, and Redis inside of Docker containers that are going to be available to our integration tests. The next thing we need to do is to write some boilerplate that's going to help us to run our integration tests. So I'm going to get rid of the default test class because we won't be needing it. And then I'm going to add a reference to the Evently API project from my users integration test project. Then I'm going to create an abstractions folder, and inside of it, let's introduce our class that's going to represent our custom web application factory. I'm going to call it integration test web app factory. And what we have to do with this type is implement an instance of the web application factory base class. So this class is coming from the Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC testing namespace, and this is what allows us to instantiate an in-memory instance of our ASP.NET Core Web API. Now I need to specify an entry point as the generic argument, and this should be our program class inside of the API project. Now if I open up the program file, you will see that this is an empty class, and to be able to reference it, we need to define a partial class here to make it explicit, and then it's going to be available for our integration tests. So now I can go back to my integration test web app factory and specify program, and it's important to pick up the one in the root namespace. You will see that we get an additional reference here inside of my integration test web app factory. I can close this down and let's go back to our integration test web app factory. The next thing I want to do is to define my container instances. So I'm going to create a Postgres container. Let's call this the database container, and we're going to create a new instance of the PostgreSQL builder. This builder class is going to help us create a new instance of the Postgres container. What you can do on the builder is specify some settings for your image. For example, I can say that I want to use the Postgres latest image for my container. I can also specify what is the database name, and I want to say that this is Evently. And you can also specify the username and password for your database. So I can say with username Postgres and with password Postgres, which are all the default values. Once I'm done configuring my container, I can say build and get back a new instance of my database container. Because we are using XUnit as our testing library, we have access to some amazing features that XUnit offers and one of those is the iAsync lifetime interface. This allows us to asynchronously run some code while initializing our test class and also while disposing the test class. And what I want to do inside of initialize async is say await database container and call the start async method. In the dispose async method, I want to stop the database container. So I will say database container stop async. And this is how I can start and stop my Postgres container as my test is initializing and disposing after executing. Let's also create another container that's going to hold our Redis instance. So this is going to be the Redis container. Let's call it Redis container, and I will create a new Redis builder. I'm just going to say with image and specify Redis latest, and I will say build, and this is enough to create my Redis container. Now let's also go ahead and start this container and stop it when we are done executing our test. You can see that I'm getting an error here because this is hiding an existing method on the web application factory. So I'm going to say that this is a new instance of this method. So why are we implementing the web application factory? It allows us to override some methods that we can use to set up our application. For example, configuring environment variables, setting up our test services, providing mock implementations of some services. There are a lot of things that we can do, and I'm going to show you how we are going to use this. One intermediate step that we could do here is expose any internal members in the projects of the users modules to our integration testing project. If I open up the users infrastructure project, you can see that I already have an internals visible to defined, exposing the types in this assembly to Evently modules users integration tests and also to the Evently integration test project that we are going to introduce in the next lesson. And this is also my preferred way of exposing internal members to other assemblies. But the only reason I use this is to facilitate testing. Now let's go back to the configure webhost method. And what I can do here is use the webhost builder to call the configure test services method. And this gives me access to the service collection interface, and I can use my services to replace any existing services, introduce new services, and in general, this is how you can prepare your services for integration testing. I'm going to paste in a code snippet that should represent a very common approach to how we can set up our integration tests, and I even use this approach in some of my examples. Now the problem is this makes our test setup very cumbersome. Here is just one example where I'm removing a registration of the user's database context DB context options instance, and then I'm registering it again by calling services add DB context, calling use mpg SQL. We are specifying the connection string of our database container, and then I'm calling use snake case naming conventions and setting up my outbox interceptor. And if we wanted to take this approach, we would need to do this setup for all of the database contexts inside of our modular monolith. Now in this example, we have 4 modules and 4 respective database contexts. And you can see that this already becomes quite cumbersome. We could make this generic, probably, but you should ask yourself, is there a better way to achieve what we want to do? And if you take a look, the only thing that's different in our testing setup is specifying a different value for the connection string. Now keep this thought in your mind, and let's take a look at another example. Oh, by the way, I left a remark that we also need to reconfigure the database connection factory to use the same connection string to Postgres. Now in this example here, I'm configuring the Redis cache options, which is used by the Stack Exchange Redis library that we are using in our cache service implementation, and I'm updating the options instance and setting the configuration property to use the connection string from the Redis container. And this is our container from the test containers library. So if this approach is cumbersome and doesn't really scale, is there a better way to achieve the desired result? I wanted to lead you in the right direction when I mentioned the connection strings, which is really the only thing that we want to change inside of this setup. So if I take a look at my application settings, you can see that I have 2 connection strings for the database and for the cache. So wouldn't it be great if we can just set some environment variable and our tests are going to pick up this value? Well, you can do this. You can just say environment, set environment variable, specify the name of your variable, which is going to be connection strings, and then database, and the value is going to be database container get connection string. It really is this simple, and this replaces all of the complicated setup that I showed you inside of the configure test services method. So I'm going to replace this with connection strings cache, and this is all we need to wire up our database context with EF Core to use the correct connection string value as well as the Redis cache. And another benefit is this will take care of wiring up the database connection factory. If I go to infrastructure configuration, you can see I'm creating an MPG SQL data source builder, adding that as a singleton service, and then configuring my database connection factory. So by setting the connection string environment variable, we take care of this setup here, as well as all of the database context configurations inside of our application. And when we configure the Redis connection string, we also solve this part here, which is creating a connection multiplexer and then adding the Stack Exchange Redis cache. I'm going to keep the infrastructure configuration open for the time being, and we can go back to our integration testing web app factory. Another external service that we have inside of the users module is our Keycloak container. And if you recall, we also installed a respective test containers library for Keycloak. Now I'm going to paste in the setup for the Keycloak container. Of course, you can grab this code snippet from under this video, and let me walk you through what we have here. But first, I'm going to add the start and stop commands for my Keycloak container so that we can get rid of the analyzer warnings. And here, let's say stop async. And now let me walk you through our setup. So we are using the Keycloak builder, specifying the Keycloak image, which is the same one that we have inside of our Docker Compose file. I'm adding a resource mapping, and this is very important for running our integration tests because I'm using the Realm export file that I have in my solution, and I'm mapping it to the respective directory where Keycloak is going to import the realms. I'm also specifying a startup command by calling the with command method and passing in import realm. And then I can build this container and use it for my integration tests. The one thing that's missing is the Realm export file, and you probably already have this file if you've been following along from the previous lessons. If you are starting from this one and you downloaded the source code, you can find this file in the .files folder in the root directory, and I'm just going to paste the file that we need into my integration testing project. Also, make sure that you check the properties for this file and specify copy if newer so that this is copied to the output directory when we build the test project. If you open up the integration testing project file, you will be able to see your Realm export file in an item group, and the preserve newest value should be specified for copy to output directory. Setting up the Keycloak container is only part of the work. We also need to configure our application to connect to this container at runtime. So I'm going to add the required code for this, and then let me walk you through what I have set up. And of course, you can grab this code snippet from right under this video. So what we are doing here is using the Keycloak container once it has started to get the base address for